my thoughts on this subject. As all of you are aware that forensics as a subject normally is looked at as a technical subject, and therefore there is a lot of discussion on what kind of tools can be used, how forensics can be achieved, etc. But my objective today is to focus on the techno-legal aspects of cyber forensics. To that extent, it will be covering areas of law more than the technology. I hope there are other sessions which Paninder has arranged where you will be discussing more of technology aspects. So with that brief definition of the scope of this talk, I would like to say that, see, when we look at cyber forensics, this cyber forensics, like any other kind of forensics, is both an art and science. And the objective is to collect, preserve, and present digital evidence. So we should not forget that the objective of successful forensics is to get an evidence accepted in a court of law. Therefore, in terms of collection of evidence, it should be done in such a manner that there is a degree of assurance which is required under the court's proceedings. Of course, if evidence is produced both in the civil cases as well as in the criminal cases, the level of assurance required may differ from a civil case and a criminal case. Okay. And we should also remember that whenever an evidence is presented, the person who is presenting the evidence has the onus of first getting it admitted, and admission is the first step, and subsequently the evidence will perhaps be disputed by the defense, and the court will have to take a view on whether the evidence can be actually accepted or not. In the case of criminal trials, we often talk of an evidence being proved beyond reasonable doubt, which is more or less considered an accepted principle of criminal jurisprudence. But people who have been handling cyber forensics are aware that perhaps this principle of beyond reasonable doubt is something which is not always possible when we are looking at cyber evidence. If you carry it to the logical end, no cyber evidence can ever be produced and proved in a court of law, because a level of uncertainty is always inherent in the cyber evidence and proving it. So the forensic persons have this challenge of bringing the evidence to as near a level of acceptance as the court may like to have. So that is one of the things which the forensic experts need to remember. Now, the purpose of evidence collection can sometimes be for mere intelligence gathering. Sometimes it may be for investigation purpose. Sometimes it may be for prosecution. In any of these cases, we are looking at some information which is present in a cyber system. When we say cyber system, we are actually looking at an electronic system where data is recorded as binary information, zeros and ones, and we call them as electronic documents. So wherever a fact is in the form of an electronic document and it has to be retrieved and presented in support of the particular litigation, you come across the cyber forensics as a method of producing evidence. Now, sometimes we hear the word ethical hacking. So when in cyber forensics, we look at discovering the evidence. Sometimes evidence will not be perhaps evident on the face of it. Based on your knowledge, you have to identify what could be the modus operandi of a criminal and where the particular evidence is likely to be found in a system, and then try to extract that. So a forensic investigator many times will have to act like a hacker, but I don't want to use the word hacker, maybe like an ethical hacker. Ethical hacker is a one who is permitted to do things which are normally considered as unauthorized access to a system. But in the case of forensics, particularly criminal investigation, many times we have a situation where the forensic investigator will come across a evidence where the owner of the device through which you have to access the evidence may not be cooperative with the investigator. He may be rather a person who is himself the accused, so he would not like to part with the evidence. He may even take the legal defense that he should not be compelled to give any evidence which is incriminatory to himself. And sometimes the data would be encrypted or stored in protected files, and the person may say, I have forgotten the passwords. So that time, the investigator may have to break into the passwords, and that is where the system of forensic investigation assumes some kind of similarity to the ethical hacking system. We must remember that courts do recognize the facts of evidence, even if they are obtained not through completely legal means. That is, if you are acquiring an evidence which is through hacking, or there is no permission of the owner of a device, still, if it is a fact, court will not refuse the evidence just because the means of obtaining the evidence was not legal. However, appropriate documentation has to be ensured by the investigator, because if on a later day, if the person who is aggrieved by your unauthorized access, who may be even perhaps a person who is at the receiving end of a judicial verdict, he may get a right to launch a counter action against the forensic investigator because of the illegal form of collection of evidence. So whenever information or evidence is collected without the permission of the owner of a computer system, the forensic investigator has to ensure that he will not be subjected to some kind of counter action, which is possible through proper documentation. Otherwise, under Information Technology Act, Section 43, which is associated with Section 66, the action of the forensic investigator may come under the purview of what is called an offense under Section 66. So every forensic investigator should remember that they should start their investigation only after ensuring that they have the permission from the owner of the device to continue his investigation. Of course, police can try to enforce their law enforcement authority, and in which case, if a private investigator is trying to assist the police, he should have a sort of a permission or the direction from the law enforcement authority, particularly the person who is the investigating officer, and who permits this private investigator to conduct whatever is the required, you can say, investigations which may involve hacking. See, sometimes it is better to go to the court and take a warrant. When you take a warrant, the warrant should not be restricted to, say, seizure of a hard disk or the device in which the particular evidence is likely to be there. The warrant should be specific, and it should say that it extends to the data which is residing inside the particular device. Because ultimately, the evidence is not the hard disk. Evidence is the data which lies inside the hard disk. So warrant to seize should not be restricted to the device. It should extend to the data. If data is not mentioned, the person may say warrant says that you can hold the hard disk in your locker, but you are not authorized to make any investigation. So that is something which the forensic investigator has to ensure. And if he is a private investigator, please ensure that the police give you a proper letter of authorization which defines the scope of what you can do, like whether you can break any passwords, whether you can look at the data. And while looking at the data, if you come across data which is not relevant for this case, but it is for some other, let us say, an offense, how do you deal with it? Okay. Now, one thing is when you look at a hard disk, you come across so much of data, and that data may be irrelevant for the particular case. So it's extraneous. It may itself amount to privacy infringement. And sometimes you also come across another offense. Now, when the forensic investigator gets the knowledge that there is a second offense which has come to his knowledge, should he share it with the police or should he remain quiet? These are all issues which needs to be sorted out. Therefore, this letter of authorization for the forensic investigator from the law enforcement should clearly state the scope of the forensic investigation, without which the investigator is putting himself in a sort of a slightly dangerous situation where he may be later on exposed to legal risks. Okay, this is before an investigation of a cyber nature is started, because you don't know what you will be finding it inside. And while doing so, whether you will destroy some other evidence, some other data, all this becomes an issue. Now, some of the challenges which we see in cyber forensics is one, of course, because internet is a borderless system, cyber crimes originate sometimes from abroad, across the jurisdiction. And so your police can only give you authority within their jurisdiction. Now, can the local police give you jurisdiction to hack a US system? Obviously not. So therefore, there are certain issues which needs to be looked at from the point of view of the jurisdiction. And that is one of the challenges which will always be tough to handle. Okay. And also the technology is evolving so fast that sometimes the devices are difficult to hack into, and sometimes encryption and anti-forensic technologies are used by technology people to prevent forensic investigation, and you should be able to get over all these things. There are, of course, whenever you break any anti-forensic, you can say, safeguard which the person has put in, obviously you are doing it without authorization, and you should be prepared to meet the consequences. There are also instances in cyberspace where evidence is not static. Okay, there is a vanishing evidence. Even your RAM evidence can be considered as one such. Whenever you switch off the machine, the evidence in the RAM may just vanish. Flash memory also, it may happen like that. So that's why in cyber forensics, the acquisition of the data, even before analysis, itself assumes a lot of importance. Okay, so vanishing evidence, sometimes people will send an email to you and say that it will be available only for 30 seconds on your system and it will vanish. Okay, it can be done for messages, it can also be done for email. So in such cases, the message may be automatically deleted, and the forensic person will have only perhaps traces of such a message having been sent and received, but access to the content will be difficult. And there are perhaps certain kinds of messages which will be structured in such a manner that when a human looks at the screen, he may not see the particular message. You require a sort of software to look at it. For example, steganography is one such situation where at first glance you will not see the evidence, but you may have it extracted using some kind of a tool. Then looking at the normal way people look at evidence, if you look at even a web page, you say the cyber system is not like any other ordinary system, because a web page which we see at any particular point of time is not one single file. It is not like a PDF file which is already there and you are viewing that and giving a sort of an evidence. Every web page is a dynamic file. It is often created on the fly, and there are several technical adjustments which are made so that depending upon which computer you are coming from, which browser you are using, which location you are coming from, the content may be rearranged and perhaps given some additional material, which means that what I see in a web page may not be the same as what you see, even if both of us are viewing a web page at the same point of time. One easiest example for this is, if the web page has got advertising material, the advertisement which is shown to me will be different from advertisement shown to you, because the web server is trying to find out who is the person who is coming at the other end, whether he is coming from India or some other place, and what are his preferences as viewed from his past, you can say, behavior on Amazon or something like that. So if I have bought some computer in Amazon, I will be getting advertisements related to that. If you have bought a food item in Amazon, you will be getting some advertisements to that of that type. So a web page is constructed through dynamic elements. Sometimes these dynamic elements are served from different jurisdictions. One thing may come from India, another may come from US, another may come from Australia. Therefore, to look at this whole as one single piece of evidence, and for this criminal jurisprudential system to accept it as a acceptable evidence is something which is difficult. That is why we are saying that this principle of evidence being provable beyond reasonable doubt should be considered as not fully applicable to cyber evidence. Otherwise, every time person can say that this is not the evidence which I saw, you saw this, but I saw something different page. So if your information is different from my information, how reliable is the evidence produced? Can be a question which you can come across in any cross-examination. You should be ready to handle that. Fortunately, Indian law has adequate provisions for this, which I will discuss a little later. As far as steganography is concerned, this has been used right in the Parliament attack case when we are informed that an Aishwarya Rai picture and some other pictures were used to hide certain information. And sometimes this steganographic image may look like any other ordinary image in the computer of a particular subject. It may look like a hobby, like a picture of a cricketer. It may look like an event picture. And for the investigator to identify that this photograph may contain a hidden steganographic information, which may be as critical as, say, Bitcoin wallet number or something like that, is something which technology poses as a huge challenge. See, we have many antivirus softwares, but this steganography is still not a fully cracked system. So to de-steganograph a particular steganography message, you require an appropriate software, and for which you should know what was the steganography software which was used by the person. So therefore, unless you investigate what are all the applications which are there in the system, and there you identify a steganography software, you will not know how to look for a de-steganography software and then examine all the images which may be there in a particular hard disk or a material. So these are some of the challenges. Of late, we are also coming across this cloud storage as providing you a big challenge. Say pen drives, mobile phones, CDs, floppies, sometimes they are available in the crime scene, so we acquire that. That is one way. But virtual places of storage, including the cloud, always pose a difficulty, because again the problem of jurisdiction comes. You have got a different country, you have got a different person, and sometimes the data will be spread over multiple clouds. So a forensic investigator should know that when he accesses a device, the evidence he is looking for need not necessarily be there in that device. It can be in any connected device. So one of the first steps of forensic investigation is to find out whether he is looking at a device which is connectable, and if so, to which other devices, and then try to extend his investigation. Then only the identification or discovery of evidence can be done with a reasonable assurance. Now, all this is technical matters. I am sure that you will have enough guidance to meet these technical requirements. But what is important for us is, having taken all the trouble to understand the technology and then acquire some evidence, the question is whether it is a reliable evidence, reliable enough to be admitted in a court of law, for which there may be a legal issue, there may be a procedural issue of the chain of custody, and otherwise there may also be an issue of who has the onus of proof for a particular evidence. Obviously, onus of proof to prove an evidence is for the person who presents it. To disprove that evidence, the other person defense has to do it. So forensics can help both proving the evidence and also disproving a presented evidence. Now, in presentation of the evidence, we come across two stages. One is admissibility, second is genuinity. Now, what is this difference? See, evidence is first presented and it is admitted as a prima facie material for trial. Then trial goes on. At the time of the trial, the defense will challenge. One of the challenges is to say that this evidence is not acceptable at all, it is not genuine, it is false, fake, etc. The second is the content of the evidence is not fully accurate, or the content of the evidence does not substantiate what this person is trying to say. These are all different degrees through which an evidential object will have to go through in the trial. So at the time of the evidence being accepted and marked for trial, what we are looking at is the admissibility of the evidence. Subsequently, the genuinity of the evidence will be coming into question, and at that time, the defense will perhaps put counter evidence. They will bring their own forensic expert to disprove what you have done. They may even cross-examine the forensic person who has presented the evidence and try to say that the information is not genuine. So there is this difference between admissibility and genuinity, and it is the onus of a person who is presenting the evidence to prove its admissibility first, and then when the other person raises a challenge, then the question of genuinity will come. Cyber evidence under Indian law is one where admissibility is the responsibility of the person who is presenting, and disproving the genuinity is the responsibility of the defense. Okay, so it is more difficult to disprove the genuinity rather from producing it as an admissible evidence. But if a person tries to manipulate the evidence and try to get it admitted, and later on it is proved that it is not genuine, it is not only a question of the evidence getting rejected, it is a question of perjury, and it will lead to larger consequences of an offense, which may be bigger than the punishment for the particular offense itself. So nobody should try to take advantage of the fact that admissibility is the onus of the presenter and disproving the genuinity is the onus of the defense. When I say that, people should not say, okay, I will present whatever is possible as an admissible document, as a fake document, let the other person disprove it. But if the other person succeeds in disproving it, you should be prepared to go to jail for 7 years, along with the person who has assisted you in producing that fake evidence. So the law takes care of this mechanism of making it possible for cyber evidence to be produced in evidence without much of a hassle, but subsequently allow it to be taken up for a trial. Okay, so with this introduction, I will go into the specific aspects of the law in India. Before that, in case you have any questions at this stage, I would like to take them, but I will not be able to follow the messages. If the panel members, organizers want to raise any questions, they can do so. Otherwise, I will continue. Okay.
So just a small instruction for all the participants. Whoever wants to ask the question, they can click on the icon of raise the hand. Whoever raises the hand, I'll allow them to speak. We have one person who has raised the hand, Mr. Balu Swaminathan. Before that, sir, we have a question.
Yeah.
Why 65B certificate is more important in the code, as by Tushali Digore.
I will cover it in the next slides. Okay. So
let me question with same participant. How to identify steganographic images?
Yeah.
How to identify steganographic images?
How to identify?
Yeah.
Okay, that is a technical question. I feel that there is no clear way of identifying the steganographic image by looking at the image. Okay. As I told you, you have to see whether in this applications accessible to the owner of this particular image, there is any evidence that he has at any point of time used a steganography application. That is, you have to go through his list of apps in his computer and then see whether there is a steganography application. That is the only indication as I see. I'm sure CDAC used to be doing some research some time back on identifying the steganographic image, like you do scanning of antivirus and other things. I am not sure whether they were successful. So to the best of my knowledge, there is no easy way of looking at an image and saying that this is likely to be a steganography image. That is when it's passed through a scanning device. Because a steganography algorithm may or may not make any changes in the picture. Okay, it may just look at a picture and see there are numbers of zeros and ones there in a particular sequence. And now through my algorithm, I will pick up certain zeros and ones. And when these are reassembled in another reader, it may become a readable information. So it may use the zeros and ones which are already available in the particular image and just pick up that particular information. So it is very difficult to look at the image. Even if you look at the header portion, I am doubtful if you can identify whether it is a image which contains hidden message or not. More than this, a person who has got a technical expertise on this can only perhaps prove me wrong on this. So I would be looking at whether there is a steganography software in this. If it is there, it is like if you have got a torrent software in your computer, then I will perhaps derive a, kind of a prima facie conclusion that you may be using torrent, you may be uploading and downloading pirated software, etc. Likewise, if you are having a steganographic software, that's a prima facie evidence. The next level of investigation the police will have to carry out to identify why this particular, where the particular steganographic software was used, whether there is log records which indicate the usage of the steganographic software, and thereby try to identify whether any steganographic information is there. If the person has deleted the steganography software and the log records associated with that, then it may become difficult. Okay, fine.
Sir, just to add on, we have one expert here who will just add on to this particular discussion.
Yeah.
We have Dr. Ranjit Singh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi. Yeah.
Sir, steganographic images can be identified through the LSB analysis, statistical analysis, and by seeing through the different pattern and the different pixels view, we can identify that. And if anyone had the question, they can write a question on the red, and we will provide the details through the email, right, Finder?
Yeah, should be good.
Yeah.
Okay. So if the algorithm modifies the zeros and ones, perhaps it is possible to scan. But if the algorithm does not modify, it just picks up a certain sequence of the digits, then it may be difficult. Anyway, it is a technical issue. I would not like to go deeper into it. Let us try to analyze what Mr. Ranjit Singh perhaps can share with the audience. Okay?
So
I will leave it there at this point of time.
Balu Swaminathan who has a question. Balu, you can go ahead.
So I want people to remember Balu Swaminathan was the cybercrime in charge of Chennai when we first used Section 65B to prove a case in a court of law. So he was my partner in creating the history of how Section 65B certificate could be used for conviction of a criminal offense. So I'm happy that he is here. Let me have the question from Balu. Yeah, Balu, go ahead. Balu, are you able to hear? Yeah.
So I think we lost the connection. We can patch him up again.
Okay, fine. Okay, now we will get into the Indian law regarding the electronic evidence. The first, of course, is Information Technology Act, Section 4, which talks about the fundamental issue that any document rendered in electronic form can be recognized as if it is equivalent to a written document. But it uses a certain conditionality that it should be accessible to be usable for a subsequent reference. Okay, so which means that for an electronic document to be legally recognized as equivalent to a paper document, that document should be accessible to be usable for a subsequent reference. So it is essential to record the document when it is first seen. If we do not record that and subsequently the forensic person says, I saw that document, that will not constitute a proper evidence. I will tell you why it is so in another instance also. Now, of course, this legal recognition does not apply to negotiable instruments other than the check, power of attorney, trust, will, and certain documents of conveyance of title, which means that they cannot be produced as evidence in a court of law also. Now, other than that, there is a system of digital signature which is used for authentication of electronic documents, and the digital signature is based on asymmetric crypto system and hash functions. But if a document is digitally signed, it can be admitted as evidence with the authentication. If it is not digitally signed, it has to be proved by other means. Now, these are all there in Information Technology Act. But when we come to the Evidence Act, Indian Evidence Act, Section 3 says that evidence means and includes electronic records produced for the inspection of the court, and the definition of electronic records will be similar to what is there in Information Technology Act. That is where the transient documents will pose a problem. Okay. Now, admission of an electronic evidence is defined by the amendment which has happened to Section 17, which says an admission is a statement which can be oral, which can be documentary, or it is contained in an electronic form. See, by mentioning that there are three types of admission statements, the Indian Evidence Act has recognized that evidence contained in electronic form is not oral. It is not even fully considered as documentary. It is a completely different type of evidence which should be considered as the third form of a statement. Under 22 capital A, you must remember that oral admissions as to the contents of the electronic records are not permitted. Okay, so this is where if you do not record an evidence when you first observe it and subsequently it is deleted, it becomes difficult to get it approved as an evidence solely by the oral evidence of the investigator. So that's why documentation is very important in the forensic investigation of the electronic document. Now, in Evidence Act, there is the Section 65A which says there are special provisions as to the evidence relating to the electronic records which are contained in Section 65B. So, Section 65B comes as a special provision as to the evidence which is mentioned in Section 65A, and it is applicable to electronic records. Just before Section 65A, we have other sections, Section 61, 62, and 63. These sections talk about how an evidence sometimes is looked at as a primary evidence and a secondary evidence, and when is secondary evidence is acceptable, what are the conditions under which secondary evidence can be accepted. These are contained in the sections 61, 62, 63, and 64. This recognizes that there are primary evidences, there are secondary evidences. Secondary evidence is acceptable when primary evidence, for some reasons, either has got itself destroyed or it cannot be produced by the person who wants to produce it as an evidence. There are several conditions mentioned, like when it is out of reach of the person and so on. So all these apply to documents which are covered under the section 61, 62, 63. However, when we come to the electronic documents, section 65A says that these are special provisions. So by stating that it says that please don't be guided by the 61, 62, 63, and 64. They are all related to non-electronic documents. 65A, which and following that, section 65B are the only documents which are relevant for the purpose, or only provisions relevant for the purpose of the producing cyber evidence. So a forensic investigator has to remember this. But you can remember that even under section 64, prior to the amendment which brought in section 65A, there were two aspects, this item number F and G, which I have highlighted here, which could have been applied to the electronic documents, and it has been applied by section 65B. It says when the original is a document of which a certified copy is permitted under the Act, then it is possible to give evidence by means of a certified copy. Second, when the fact is to be proved, requires a collection of things, then also sometimes secondary document is the only possibility. This had been recognized even before the advent of the cyber evidence. But as regards cyber evidence, section 65A leaves nothing to doubt. It says that this is a special provision as to be relating to the electronic records. Okay. Now we will go into this concept of section 65B. While discussing section 65B, for us, primary and secondary has got no special significance. In fact, when we discuss electronic documents, it is better we don't use the term primary and secondary, because in electronic documents, whatever evidence is perceived by a human being on the screen of a computer, or when he hears something in the speakers, these are all secondary renditions of a binary information which is lying somewhere inside the computer resource. In fact, that is the primary evidence. That is the zeros and a sequence of zeros and ones, the binary data which lies inside the computer in some storage form. That is the primary evidence. That primary evidence has to be extracted using certain applications and devices, hardware and software, and then rendered on the screen as a human readable information. So therefore, what we humans look at as evidence is actually a dependent evidence, in the sense that it depends on what devices you have used. If you have used a wrong device, you will definitely see a wrong image. If the document is in French, you are looking at it in English word processor, you will see something which is incorrect. So therefore, the evidence which the court has to take on note is dependent on the devices which are used by the human beings to convert the primary digital notations of zeros and ones lying inside the computer to a human readable form, which could be text, sound, or image. That is why I normally don't use the term primary and secondary in the case of electronic documents. Sometimes people refer to the hard disk or a CD as if it is a primary evidence. Even in some judgments, it has been referred to like this is the primary evidence. Okay, but that also is something which is incorrect. The hard disk or a CD is only a container of an electronic information, and it is because you cannot present the zeros and ones as it is, you have to put it inside a box and then present it. So therefore, what we see as hard disk or CD is only a sort of a container of electronic document, and therefore when an evidence has to be presented, the evidence has to be presented as to what was the binary content of the particular evidence and what is the expression it will render when you look at it through a computer. This is what section 65B does. What section 65B says is, court will take cognizance of an evidence not because you have thrown in the CD in front of the judge, but because you are telling the judge that this CD contains some electronic documents. But what it contains is contained in the section 65B certificate which I am giving, which says that this is the content which is there in this particular file, and I saw that particular content by connecting this CD or hard disk to a computer, and I used this software, this software, this software. Afterwards, I saw something on my screen, and this is the printout of that. That is section 65B certified copy of a electronic document expressed in a human consumable form. Okay, so this is section 65B section, which is included in the Indian Evidence Act along with the Information Technology Act. Now, I will take questions on this subsequently. I will just explain this section. Then we will go into questions, because on section 65B, there have been many doubts, and though the first time this was used was in the Suhas Katti case in 2004, where Balu was the investigating officer. I produced this evidence with section 65B certificate. It was admitted by the magistrate's court and punishments were given. Since 2004, until around 2012, nobody recognized the existence of section 65B, and not even 2012, 2014, when the Bashir judgment came, then only people realized that there is a law like this, and then started giving some importance to this section 65B certification. But in this process, not all experts have the same kind of understanding. There are certain differences. So obviously my view will be somewhat different from somebody else's view. I take it as acceptable, because this is cyber jurisprudence under development. So before we come into the questions on those things, section 65B has got 5 subsections. The first subsection introduces a terminology called computer output, and it says that computer output can be produced as evidence and it will be admissible without the production of the original. So this clearly mentions that section 65B is regarding converting the binary data, which is the evidence, into a form called computer output, and rest of the section of subsections 2, 3, 4, and 5 refer to the rendition of this computer output, not to how the original binary data got accumulated in the computer. Subsection 2 talks about conditions for producing the computer output. Subsection 3 recognizes that sometimes there will be multiple computers which will be used for rendering the computer output. And subsection 4 prescribes the requirements of the certification. Subsection 5 recognizes that sometimes humans may not be involved in rendering a computer output. There may be automated systems. That is also recognized. So these 5 subsections address different forms of the different things required to produce a computer output, and that computer output, if it is produced and certified as per section 65B subsection 4, it is admissible without the production of the original. Okay. Now, just to go through these subsections, the very first subsection says that any information which is printed on a paper or stored in an electronic form, that is both a soft copy as well as a print copy. These are the 2 modes in which a computer output can be produced, and they shall be deemed also as a document if the conditions mentioned in this particular section are fulfilled. So that is the basic meaning of this subsection 1. Okay, there is no need to provide the original hard disk, original CD, or anything which you otherwise call as original, like when you have a camera, the card, which is a memory card that is containing the original hard, digital recordings of a particular picture, you may not be required to present that in the court of law, but a copy, if it is produced as a computer output as per the section, it will be admissible. Okay. Then the subsection 2 says that this computer output has to be produced by a person who is having a lawful control over the computer which is producing the computer output. Hence, we have a confusion whether this lawful control refers to the person who had the lawful control over the original or lawful control over the process through which computer output was produced. So please remember that section 65b(2) refer to the conditions referred to in subsection 1 in respect of a computer output. So what is a computer output is there in section 65b(1), and the conditions mentioned here is in respect of a computer output. We'll come back to this little later. The third thing says that if it's a network, multiple computers are used, they will all be considered as a single computer. So even a printer is a different computer. So if the computer is one and then there's a printer, the computer output produced with a combination of computer is acceptable. The certification process itself says that the certificate should contain it should identify the electronic records which are the subject matter of the evidence, which will be say annexure 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever way you want to present it. Then the certificate should give particulars of any device which is used in the production of the electronic record, and dealing with any matters which the subsection 2 relate. Subsection 2 relates to subsection 1. Therefore, how the particular computer output was produced, what were the devices which were used for that purpose, that need to be recorded in this certificate. Okay, and it has to be signed by the person who is occupying a responsible official position related to the operation of the relevant device, which is the device which is producing the computer output. So the certifier produces a computer output and he gives this kind of assurances based on which the section 65b certificate is signed. Okay, this is section 65b certificate, which is essential for admissibility. Now, after it is admissible, if it has to be questioned for genuinity, the law provides that under section 79A of Information Technology Act, certain organizations have been declared as digital evidence examiners, and the court can call the assistance of these people for the purpose of the disproving the evidence which has already been admitted. Presently, there are only 4 accredited section 79A laboratories: 1 Computer Science and Data Mining Laboratory, New Delhi; Directorate of Forensic Science, Gandhinagar, Gujarat; Central Forensic Laboratory, Hyderabad; Army Cyber Group, and they recently Bangalore Forensic Laboratory. So totally 5 laboratories are accredited under section 79A. They are all government labs, because under 88/2000 it can be only the government labs which can be certified. Private labs can work in association with those labs, and these section 79A labs can act as an expert under section 45A of Indian Evidence Act and can be called in by the court to resolve any differences in forensic reports. So I will stop at this for a time before I go into the case studies on section 65B. I can take a few questions presently, and then we will get into the specific case studies. Okay. Yeah, Patindra, any questions?
Sir, Dr. Narendran has a question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I can. Yeah, thank you. So you are trying to say there is, little ambiguity in terms of, regulating the sections itself, since you are having your own, the scope in the, I mean to say, like, your own interpretation. In that, the situation, what is the probability of, the success rate in terms of winning the cases while, presenting the evidences in front of the court, as well as, during the trial, how it is going to help you to, win the cases? It's more on, generic question, actually. Yeah.
See, Section 65B is only regarding the procedure under which electronic evidence can be made admissible in a court of law. Okay. Now, it involves, prior to presenting a Section 65B, forensic activities will go on. For example, you may be using an NK software or undeleted software, or whatever you may do. That's all forensic techniques you use. You have to properly record that in the forensic report. If you don't do that, in the cross-examination, your evidence can be challenged on procedural grounds. Even before we come to the genuinity, on procedural grounds, if your Section 65B certified presentation, that presentation can be in printed form if you can print it out. It can be in soft copy form if certain things cannot be printed out, like audios and videos. You have to present it in soft copy form. Normally we present it on the CD, but the hash value of that document is recorded in the forensic report, so that people can check and verify whether what is being viewed or seen is same as what has been mentioned in the Section 65B report, quoting the hash value. But the Section 65B certificate cannot go beyond this admissibility. And if there is a question on genuinity, the cross-examination will have to first break the procedure and say procedure was not followed or is not recorded in the Section 65B certificate. If it is not recorded, then the evidence may fail on technical grounds. See, the idea of Section 65B certificate recording the procedure is that if the same stated procedure is reproduced by some other person, he should normally get the same kind of result, unless, of course, the evidence has been removed. So the court expects that a procedure is properly recorded so that a second investigator can follow the same procedure and he should get the same result. Okay. Now, whether the procedure used was correct or incorrect, that is for proving or disproving the genuinity of the examination. That is the second level of trial. Now, the person who is producing the Section 65B certificate, normally at the first stage, he will only defend the certificate. Okay. But behind that, if he has used some technology, then the cross-examination may try to say that the technology which you have used itself is faulty and therefore your results are not reliable. That is something what this Section 45A accredited expert, who is a Section 79A identified laboratory, can do. So please distinguish admissibility from genuinity. Admissibility is a procedural issue. Genuinity can go into much deeper, but that can be done only by a Section 45A expert. And one indication is that 79A labs will be considered as 45A experts. If any individual expert has to be considered as 45A expert, it is subject to the discretion of the court. Okay.
All
If
right.
you're not satisfied, you tell me again what is the exact doubt.
It makes sense, your answers. So I just have the quick question, which is continuation of your answers. I'm little afraid in terms of what you were saying. If the genuine forensics expert tries to present his the analysis report in front of the court, in some circumstances, like the defense lawyer or somebody else, the opposite forensics expert may try to claim, hey, they submitted the evidences are really false evidences. But the ground reality is the submitted evidence which are presented by the the petition, for example, it's really the genuinity. In the sense, the defense, the expert, the forensics expert may try to
my suggestion in that case is, say,
okay.
you ask the court to admit what you have presented if it satisfies the section 65B for subsection 4 requirements. And courts have permitted that if you have already submitted a certificate and it is not fully correct, they will give you opportunity to correct it and submit also. Okay, basically, if you have omitted certain procedures and other things, you can request the court, I will correct that in terms of the procedure used if the certificate is not fully correct. So they will accept the section 65B certificate with some modifications, which of course the defense will start questioning why how you can change the section 65B certificate. But at present, courts are accepting the modification, and they say section 65B certificate can be produced anytime during the trial, not necessarily at the time of charge sheet, even later. So insist that your document should be admitted. Now, if the other person has got a challenge, he has to bring counter evidence, and you ask him to produce a counter section 65B certified evidence. Don't let him simply question your section 65B evidence, but ask him, you bring another 65B certified evidence. Why this section 65B certified evidence is required is, you are not letting only the lawyer to put questions on you. Let there be another forensic expert who puts in his efforts on the witness box and be prepared to be held for perjury if he is bringing any fake evidence. If you let only the lawyer to cross-examine you without a supporting evidence, then it is laissez-faire for the lawyers. Okay, they will ask any question and you will find it difficult to prove certain things. Okay, so I feel the correct position there is to tell the court that we are submitting this evidence and it is under section 65B admissible. Okay, I am the person who has signed this, so I am putting my signature there, and if anything is considered or if it's proved to be false, it will be my responsibility. So that much of responsibility I am taking. If for some reason the other party is saying this is not genuine, either the court should call an expert on its own, which is section 79A lab, whom you can cross-examine, or they can call another private forensic expert and let him produce some evidence, forensic evidence of his own, which it should be again section 65B certified. And then you can cross-examine him on that under section 45A. You see, section 65B evidence is a matter of fact evidence. I am only saying that I saw some evidence, I captured it by this means, and here is the admissible evidence. But 45A evidence is an expert evidence. I can ask questions on how a person came to an opinion on that. In section 65B, there is no opinion. Section 65B is a matter of fact certification. I used a Windows computer. I went into the internet. I typed www so-and-so. A page appeared there. I took a printout and I am signing that this is a faithful reproduction of what I saw on the screen. That is a factual protection mistake. So I will not, as a section 65B certifier, stand up to any cross-examination which says, if somebody asks, what is your opinion whether this website is fake or genuine, I will say that is not my botheration. I am here only to say that when I type www so-and-so in my computer on such and such a day at such and such a time, this is what appeared. And I am giving you only the evidence for that particular thing. Don't ask me for opinion whether it is genuine or not. That is something which an expert can give. And that expert will come at the second stage of trial. Don't put the section 65B forensic investigator into embarrassment by making him justify what is not part of the section 65B certificate. You tell the court that oral evidence is not permitted on electronic evidence under section 22 capital A. So whoever is saying that my evidence is wrong, he should also bring certain documentary material to with a Section 65B certificate, then we will fight on one 65B certificate versus another 65B certificate. Is it okay?
Yeah, all right. Sounds answer. Thank you.
Sir, we have Mr. Balu Swaminathan.
Yeah, Balu. Yeah,
So
Balu.
you have to unmute your microphone. Balu Swaminathan, sir,
Hello.
please. Yeah, you can go ahead now.
Is it audible now?
Yeah,
Audible now, sir. Go ahead.
Good afternoon to all. Thank Mr. Navi and others for arranging a web session during this lockout. First of all, we don't have any separate procedure for investigating cybercrime. Is it correct? We are using only the criminal procedure code, which is formulated for investigating traditional crimes. So, here, investigation is the exclusive subject of the police. We are using, you have mentioned forensic investigation and other things. This is analysis, forensic analysis. Even traditional crime also, we are using the experts' help for even to take fingerprint or anything. So here, in 2004 also, I utilized the services of Mr. Navi. He is an expert. I utilized his services. I was able to get success in that case. Now also I am saying here cybercrime investigation has to be outsourced, except arrest and such persons or such places. Other things, because day by day technology is going on developing. So we need experts, depends upon the cases. One thing. Another thing, you have mentioned about beyond reasonable doubt. Even traditional case also, even one of the case, eyewitness, actually the person has motive for the murder, but he was not at all, he was not in the place. But the deceased wife saying she was present at the scene of crime. She saying so and so was present. He also used a weapon to murder my husband. So we have no other go. We have recorded a statement of eyewitnesses. She also deposed in the court. Maybe because the defense created so many doubts, but judge decided the case. So similar situation is also happening in the cyber evidences. They are, when you are seizing the hard disk, why not you give a copy or something? They are asking. Here, no facility is at present available. Though no statutory procedure is also not available. But doubts can be created at any stage. So this is all fatal. So there are so many things we have to compare with the traditional investigation. We have to compare. We have to formulate separate procedure code for collecting the evidence. We have police role only collecting, analyzing different forensic expert. They have after analyzing, we have to get a lead. So in that way, we have to discuss. We have to represent. Even 79A, the four few government examiner, the state government examiner declared as an expert. But what about Tamil Nadu? What will happen those cases? They are asking questions.
Okay.
Asked me, Tamil Nadu has been recognized as an expert under Section 45A. So I have to accept. So judge denied the total evidence, acquitted the case. Thank you.
There was one Calcutta case where the normal forensic lab, which was not accredited at that time under Section 79A, was accepted by the court for this purpose, taking into consideration that not many such certified 79A labs were present. But that is a discretion which the judge has to exercise. Probably, if you record that, then maybe in the appeal, you have to again take it up as a trial which was not conducted properly. Okay. Then
Thank
Akhil
you.
Kumar.
Sir, we have Mr. Akhil Kumar.
Yeah, please. Yes, Akhil.
So I think Akhil microphone is not working. So we have one Mr. Harish who has put a question.
Yeah.
In case of a corporate decides to do forensic investigation against an employee suspecting without going to police or the court, what are the legal implications? In such case, the suspecting employee challenges the procedure, and if he goes to the court.
See, in all internal audit, this internal forensic investigation would be required, and it will be required before ascertaining whether a crime has happened or not. So the internal investigation will be doing that. So you have to adopt the same section 65B procedure and document it. And if after this documentation, if you come across a cognizable offense, you can also report it to the police. I have actually done many such investigations for the company. I have ensured that if I had done it for a court or if I had done it for a police, whatever precautions would have been taken, I have taken in that also, and that evidence has been produced in the court. So far, as long as the procedure is correct, that is why every company, the internal audit department should know what is Section 65B procedure. You cannot make a roving investigation, just make some capture of screenshots and other things, and then on one fine day in the court you find that it is not Section 65B certified. Then when you go back, you may not find that same document. Then you will lose an opportunity to produce a proper certified copy. So procedure has to be followed. If procedure is not followed, it can be questioned on the procedure alone. On technical grounds, the evidence may be rejected, even without going into the question of genuinity and other things. So you have to take care.
Mr. Harish, do you have any follow-up question?
Yeah, my question is not for the purpose of the court. If one has to, the corporate decides for the, he is suspecting an employee and they are doing some.
I understand. See, if some procedure has been set for judicial proceedings, any other disciplinary authority, it is good if they follow that standard of judicial process only. Okay. Otherwise, you should be open to the employee taking it up to a judicial forum on a later day. So if he agrees with the disciplinary proceedings, does not challenge your evidence, that is different. Okay. If both the parties agree, something which is not an evidence as an evidence, nobody can do anything. But if one of the persons has an ability to challenge it outside your disciplinary proceedings into a court, you also be better prepared in that first place itself to create the evidence at the standards which the courts would expect. So I feel you should not neglect that just because it is an internal investigation. And that's why when I discuss this data protection also, I have said that Section 65B is relevant to data protection officers, just to understand, because otherwise we keep on taking evidence and we don't store it in a proper manner, and many times this will be required on a later date. So there is one case, this Tiwari versus Arjun Singh case, which is very interesting. In this case, the question of what is called contemporaneous certification came up for discussion. What is that? That is, when an electronic evidence is captured in one state, then you put it into some computer. Then from that computer, you transfer it to a pen drive. From the pen drive, you put it into a CD and produce into the court. So like that, you have got multiple stages in which the electronic evidence is copied and recopied. What the court has said in this is, at each of those stages, you need a Section 65B certificate. So the first certificate will say, I saw from the camera memory card, I transferred it to my CD or a hard disk. That will be done by the person who transferred the memory card to the hard disk. That is Mr. A. And let us say after 3 months, Mr. B comes, looks at it in the hard disk, and from there he transfers it to a pen drive. Mr. B will give a certificate saying that I saw the electronic document in my department's computer and then transferred it to this pen drive. I certify it under section 65B. And next, that is transferred elsewhere. So this stage by stage, different persons who are responsible for the change of this electronic document from one state to another have to give a section 65B certificate. This is what was referred to as contemporaneous certificate in this Tiwari versus Arjun Singh case. So in a corporate entity, sometimes you have to capture what is called potential evidence. I call that as potential evidence. You don't know whether it is required or not. But potential evidence has to be stored with a section 65B certificate so that as and when it is required, it can be transferred. See, in the case of this Afzal Guru case, okay, which immediately followed this Suhas Katti case. I'll just briefly tell you what was Suhas Katti case. Suhas Katti case was a case where a person had put a defamatory message about a lady in Yahoo group message. So when the case was filed under section 67, we had to capture the evidence of the crime. Obviously, you cannot seize the hard disk of Yahoo for this purpose, but I was sitting in Chennai. When I logged into groups.yahoo.com, made some search, I got one message on my computer. I said, I am taking the printout of this, and that is section 65B certified. That was the evidence which was used in this Suhas Katti case, which was historically the first case in which conviction happened under Information Technology Act. So the success of section 65B certificate is evident there. There I was presented as an expert evidence, expert witness, and cross-examination did ask the question. I was not an employee of any government organization. How can a private person give a section 65B certificate? But the court felt that there is nothing in section 65B which says that only a government official should give. This 79A came much later. At that time, it was not there. So my evidence was accepted, and based on which conviction happened. So that is a success. Immediately following this, there was another case in Chennai, which did not go into the record because this case was withdrawn in between. But this was very much significant from the point of view of establishing the cyber jurisprudence on section 65B. This was a Trisha defamation case where the police had produced a CD as evidence. It was available to the judge to view and take a decision. This is like the original was before the court. But that magistrate knew that he should not look at this evidence and take it on record and go ahead with the trial. So he invited me to make an observation, convert this CD information to a computer output under section 65B, give a certificate, and based on that, he continued the trial. This established a principle that even when the original hard disk or original CD is given, is before the court, to appreciate that as evidence, you still need to have some observer go through that and convert it into a section 65B certificate. The judge should not take a view on it on his own. If he takes it, he becomes a witness to say that this electronic evidence means this. Okay, that important responsibility is taken care of by section 65B certifier. So these two were there. When Afzal Guru case came, this was the Parliament attack case. This was a case where certain records of the mobile service provider had been given in the form of a CD earlier, which was not section 65B certified because people did not know that at that point of time, though this was available in law. So when the actual case came on trial, Prashant Bhushan was the defense counsel. He did raise an objection that this is not section 65B certified, but he didn't have the conviction to carry that further. So what the prosecution said was they brought the Airtel AGM or whoever was responsible to the witness box, and that witness stated what was there in the particular electronic record, and the oral evidence was accepted, and the court felt that since this has been corroborated by the personal witnesses here, we don't have to worry about the non-availability of Section 65B certificate. So that's why from 2005 onwards, people gave very little credence to whatever we were saying that Section 65B is a mandatory requirement, until this Anwar versus Bashir case came up in 2014, which very clearly clarified that it is mandatory to have Section 65B certificate, and this distinguished the two stages of trial, which is admissibility and genuinity, and said at the time of admissibility, only 65B is relevant. Now, at the time of genuinity, if there is a question, we will look at the other aspect. This was Bashir's judgment. Please go through it in detail later on. Then came this Tiwari judgment on the contemporaneous certificate, where when it is transferred from one medium to another, at each stage, a certificate can be attached, and then final stage is presented to the court. There was also a case about whether Section 65B certificate, which is mandatory since 17th October 2000, if it has not been given and some cases have been decided, convictions have happened, what to do? In this Sonu versus Amar case, the court held that let us not reopen old cases, let us leave them as it is and apply it for new cases. But very recently in 2018, there was a case called Shafi Mohammed case, which again muddied the whole system. This was the Bashir judgment was a 3-bench judgment. A 2-member judgment of a Supreme Court in Shafi Mohammed case gave a very bizarre judgment, saying that certain cases, Section 65B certificate need not be insisted or considered mandatory. That was the cases where the person who is presenting the evidence does not have the control of the device. If he has got the device, then he should produce Section 65B certificate. If he doesn't have the device, he need not produce the device. This is what the Shafi Mohammed judgment said, which means that if you are talking of a Facebook profile, the device is not with you, it is with Facebook, so you don't require a Section 65B certificate. If you are having a laptop with you, which you can actually put it into the court's custody itself, at that time Section 65B certificate is required. This was the bizarre judgment of Shafi Mohammed, which was ab initio incorrect. And fortunately, in this year, 2019, the court itself has realized that it was a wrong decision, and it has referred it to a bigger bench, and therefore we can say that has been kept in abeyance. The Bashir judgment, which is a 3-member judgment, whereas Shafi Mohammed was a 2-member judgment, doesn't have any legal precedence as of now. So mandatory nature of Section 65B stands as of today. This is some of the cases which you must be aware of, which perhaps gives answers to some of the questions which you may be having. Any further doubts, you please go through this particular judgment. And if you go through my website called Cyber Evidence Archival Center, ceac.in, as well as navi.org, I have discussed most of these cases and my views on that. Even though there are certain differences, as I told you, regarding this lawful control, etc., my views I have tried to explain very clearly. And there is also a book on cyber, Section 65B clarified, which also contained, which is presently available in electronic form. Physical copies may not be available, but it explains more about these things, as well as the format in which a certificate has to be given. So my point is, forensics does not end with your technical capability, which may be the best in the world, okay? But if you want it to be successful and accepted as admissible, you must remember that you need to give a Section 65B certificate even to the forensic report created by a government lab. Otherwise, even government lab certificate may be rejected. And if the evidence has in the meantime vanished, you will not be able to get a Section 65B certificate by a second observation. So you would have lost it forever. So all the forensic technical experts must remember that there is this section 65B and it has to be recorded. Some of the softwares, including I think NCase, will create automatically a sort of a document of observation. And that from that document of observation also you can create the section 65B certificate. But the procedure that you use an NCase software, which version and on which computer, which device, should all be part of the section 65B certificate. So this is what I wanted to bring to the knowledge of all the technical experts here. If any more questions are there, I am still willing to take it.
Sir, indeed, there was one question from Akhil. Akhil had asked a question on the chat window here.
Yeah.
He's asking about the, one moment. Yeah, about the additional tools used in forensics like robotic automation process applications and artificial intelligence processes. Okay, and where do they stand as a logic of operation? They stay outside the case and they can be generic and blind to the particular case. How the admissibility of result from such artificial intelligence based tool can be ensured?
See, under section 65B, you identify the tool. Now, if the tool is a standard tool, a proprietary tool, then the defense may call the proprietary tool owner to get more information. Okay. But if you cannot say that something is completely blind, you have used artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence activities are always related to the person who caused that software to behave in a particular manner. So I can bring the artificial intelligence tool owner, company owner, to the witness box and cross question him. Okay. So under the section 65B certificate, you record clearly what kind of certificate, tools you used. And people like us normally record every window of that particular tool as it is, as I go through the process of observation, so that when the tool is opened, this is a screenshot. When I brought in this file, this was a screenshot. Then this result came, this is a screenshot, kind of a thing. You have to, either you can do a video graphing of that, or screenshots you have to capture and put it into your document. Therefore, you will take care that you have explained the whole system, identifying the tool, so that if somebody else sits to repeat the same thing with the same tool, he should get the same result. That is what section 65B observer will take care. For example, you are taking a photograph. How does the camera work? You may not know. Camera itself may do some adjustments in exposure, etc. That is all automatic. But when I say that I've used a Kodak camera, so and so, I am giving an impression that, okay, this Kodak camera, if somebody else knows, does this automatic settings. It has got a filter. So therefore, colors are not necessarily the realistic. So that is something which the cross-examination person can make use of. So put in the tools into the report, and that is section 65B person's responsibility. Bhimesh had some question.
Yes, sir. How are you, sir?
I am fine. Yeah.
Yeah. Quick question. Digital evidence is so fragile, and let's say you got a certificate from 65B as per that section IT Act. When you go to the court, thinking it's going to be admissible. So, but due to some problem, like there was a situation that the integrity of the evidence was questioned. Did you face this kind of situation in your life so far? So
plenty. In fact, I have so far given about 140 certificates since 2004, okay, at different courts. Okay, the first question, many times the evidence would be changed. For example, in many times copyright cases, some website is giving your information, kind of a thing. I always suggest people, before you file a complaint, you first capture your evidence. The moment you file a complaint, the person will remove that content. Okay. So there are many instances when it will not be present when you are standing before the court. So that is why credibility of the person who is giving section 65B evidence becomes absolutely important.
Wow.
You cannot get any Tom, Dick and Harry to give a certificate because the court the defense will automatically ask, even they have asked me several times, they have said, you have taken money from the person. See, obviously I'm giving a professional service, I charge a fees. So
Right.
you have taken the money, therefore you have given whatever evidence the person wants. Okay, this is a charge they can make. But it is for the court to decide whether they should believe me. That's why in all my Section 65B certificates, I put my 20 years history of cyber evidence archival center. Saying that in 2004, I gave the first evidence, kind of a thing. Credibility becomes very important. In fact, that also somebody has asked. In 65B certificate, why are you giving Suhas cutting case as if you are trying to blow your own trumpet? I have said that there is an annexure. It is essential for credibility purpose. So that is an issue.
Okay.
People are also asking for my expertise. Okay. So expertise, are you a lawyer? Are you a computer engineer? Say Section 65B certificate does not base itself on whether you have a BE degree or whether you have an LLB degree. It is an observation of an electronic document and recording it faithfully. And as long as you can prove your credibility, rest of the expertise is not very high, except in a forensic situation. If you are using NCASE, you should be having that much of expertise to use NCASE. Okay. So that is one of the things, Section 60. That's why many times, for example, if a company, you ask one of your IT managers to take the certificate, it is not the best in your interest, because the IT manager has got a vested interest. It is like a self-certification.
Right.
You must get a trusted third-party certificate so that in the court you should be able to say honestly that that person doesn't have a vested interest to support me, because Section 65B evidence is not an evidence for a particular person. It is assisting the court to bring the electronic form of evidence into a more easy form in which the court can appreciate. I look at me as more a servant of the court when I present a Section 65B evidence. Though in many matrimonial cases, many times people feel that when I give an evidence, I am supporting either the husband or the wife. But actually, I'm not doing either of that. I'm saying that when I looked at a computer, this is what I saw. Now, whether it supports A or B, it is for the lawyers to take a view and the court to take a view. So corporates ensure that you have a trusted third-party certification if there is a company interest involved. Okay.
So if they don't have a third party, it's like marking their own homework, That's what I think court believes,
Yes.
right, sir?
Yeah. So it will be questioned.
Yeah.
There is the quality of evidence will be questioned. Okay, in certain cases you may do it because you don't have any other option, but you should be prepared to tell the judge that we had no other option, that's why we did it. Then the quality of the evidence will be considered lower.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
So we have one last question for this hour.
Yeah.
Dilpreet Bajwa. The question is, why not the open source tools be used for authenticating or examination of the electronic evidences?
You
Why
can
should we always use the commercial applications is what the question is.
No, you can use open source tool. I have no issue. Mention the tool and the time version of the tool, because of subsequently the tool may change, and if necessary, please hold a copy of that version, because tomorrow if that version is no longer available anywhere and if defense takes a stand, the current tool version does not give this kind of a result, then you will not be able to prove that no, this kind of result would have come in the previous version. So the previous version also better hold as a part of the Section 65B evidentiary form itself. In the tool itself, you can mention in the Section 65B certificate itself in the soft copy form that a copy of this tool is also available here. Hash value of that tool file is this much. Okay.
Okay, so with this, we'll conclude our session for the day. Sir, I personally thank you for sparing your time for the benefit of the people who were passionate about listening to your lecture. And with all said and done, what you discussed was probably never thought in any of the academic syllabus of the forensic sciences today. So I thank you very much for sharing your valuable time for the benefit of the students, especially at this COVID lockdown situation, sir.
Thank you.
And for the instructions of all the participants, this session is concluded right now, and we have the session at 2:30. The topic on firearm examination by Mr. Mohammed, the officer of Dubai Police. On the topic Challenge the firearm examiner if you dare. Thank you very much. Have a good day. We'll get back to the session at 2:30 this afternoon.
Thank you.